The neighborhood of Sterling Heights was an architectural testament to the power of exclusion, a sprawling landscape of manicured emerald lawns and neoclassical mansions that seemed to hum with the quiet arrogance of extreme wealth. Every hedges was trimmed to a surgical precision, and the air carried the sterile, artificial scent of expensive fertilizers and automated sprinkler systems that guarded the perimeter of this gilded cage. High-definition security cameras, discreetly tucked under the eaves of slate roofs, acted as unblinking eyes, scanning the sidewalks for anything that disrupted the neighborhood's carefully curated aesthetic of purity. It was a place where peace was enforced through a sense of heavy surveillance, a silent warning to anyone who didn't possess the right zip code, or the expected complexion that they were being watched with a deep, systemic suspicion. Marcus Thorne sat on a weathered stone bench at the edge of the community park, his casual joggers and hooded sweatshirt making him appear like just another morning jogger catching his breath in the shade. However, beneath the relaxed exterior, his mind was operating with the cold, rhythmic efficiency of the specialized CIA operative he had become over a decade of high-stakes fieldwork. His eyes, dark and analytical, didn't just see the beauty of the park. They mapped out exit routes, identified tactical cover, and tracked the heat signatures emanating from the mansion 300 yards away. For Marcus, the world had long ago ceased to be a place of human connection, transforming instead into a complex chessboard of threats and assets where every civilian was a potential variable in a global game of shadows. Near the flower beds, a 9-year-old boy named Julian sat in the grass, his simple, dirt-stained jeans a stark contrast to the pristine environment that surrounded him. He was the son of the immigrant landscaper who worked tirelessly in the background, a child who had learned to move through these streets with a quiet, invisible grace to avoid the piercing glares of the homeowners. In his small, calloused hands, he clutched a tattered schoolbook about the history of aviation, his eyes following the distant vapor trails of commercial jets with a hunger that transcended his humble circumstances. Julian looked at the sky not as a void, but as a vast, fence-free frontier where the labels of outsider or laborer couldn't reach him, a place where his dreams could finally take flight without being grounded by the weight of prejudice. Marcus adjusted the controls of a compact, high-tech drone that hovered silently above the park, its camera lens focused with predatory intent on the smuggler's estate disguised as a luxury residence. Julian, drawn by the soft, mechanical hum of the rotors, slowly approached the bench, his curiosity momentarily overriding the fear he had been taught to feel in the presence of strangers in this neighborhood. In a rare, unscripted moment of humanity that pierced through his tactical armor, Marcus looked up and offered the boy a small, genuine smile, beckoning him closer to see the world from a bird's-eye perspective. For a brief second, the spy and the dreamer shared a connection, looking through the monitor at a horizon that looked remarkably different when viewed from 1,000 feet above the constraints of the earth. The fragile moment was shattered by the sharp, aggressive clicking of heels against the pavement as a middle-aged woman in designer activewear marched toward them, her face contorted in a mask of performative outrage. She didn't see a citizen or a curious child. She saw an intrusion into her private utopia, her voice rising in a shrill, hysterical crescendo that echoed off the surrounding stone walls. "I knew you didn't belong here. I saw you spying on my property with that device!" she screamed, her finger pointing accusingly at Marcus before she swung her foot, kicking his tactical backpack into the dirt. She turned her venom toward Julian, shouting that people like them were the reason the neighborhood needed higher gates and more security, her words acting like physical blows to the boy's fragile sense of belonging. Julian's eyes filled with sudden hot tears as he shrank back, his aviation book falling into the mud as he began to stammer out a frantic apology for a crime he hadn't committed. He took the blame for the commotion, his small shoulders hunched in a posture of defeat that Marcus recognized all too well from his own youth, before he had become untouchable. The agent's tactical coldness didn't just crack, it disintegrated, replaced by a cold, focused fury that had nothing to do with international arms smugglers and everything to do with the child's crushed spirit. Marcus stood up slowly, his posture shifting from relaxed observer to a lethal presence of authority, his gaze locking onto the woman with a terrifying intensity that signaled the mission had just shifted from a global threat to a local reckoning. Marcus Thorne had spent nearly 2 decades refining the art of becoming nobody, a ghost in the machinery of global intelligence who operated in the cold, gray spaces where morality often blurred into necessity. Before he was a special agent for the CIA, he was a young man from a neighborhood not unlike the one Julian's father likely called home, a place where survival required a sharp mind and an even sharper instinct for danger. He joined the military to escape the limitations of his birth, eventually rising through the ranks of elite special operations, before being recruited into the agency's most secretive programs. Over the years, the missions had become increasingly brutal, requiring him to suppress his empathy in favor of cold, tactical outcomes that protected a country that often didn't recognize his face or his sacrifices. He had become a master of the checkmate, a man who viewed human interactions as data points rather than emotional exchanges. The emotional numbness Marcus felt was a defense mechanism, a thick layer of scar tissue over a soul that had seen too many betrayals and too much collateral damage in the name of national security. He had hunted arms dealers in the dusty backstreets of Karachi and tracked cyber terrorists through the neon-soaked alleys of Tokyo, always maintaining a professional distance that kept him sane. But this distance came at a high cost, leaving him isolated in a world of classified files and temporary identities, where he no longer knew how to be a person outside of a mission profile. He saw the world through a thermal lens, focusing on heart rates and hidden weapons, completely forgetting the simple beauty of a child looking at the sky. His life was a series of calculated risks and strategic retreats, a solitary existence that lacked the warmth of a home or the tether of a genuine human connection. Julian, meanwhile, lived in a world of vibrant colors and sharp, painful boundaries, where his presence was often treated as a visual blemish on the landscape of the ultra-wealthy. His father, a man of few words and calloused hands, had taught him that the best way to survive in Sterling Heights was to be silent, industrious, and entirely forgettable to the residents. Julian spent his afternoons among the flower beds, his nose buried in books about aerodynamics and jet propulsion, dreaming of a life where the horizon wasn't blocked by iron gates and private property signs. He possessed a purity of spirit that even the daily microaggressions of the wealthy neighbors couldn't quite extinguish, a resilient hope that one day he would build something that could carry him far away from the dirt he stood in. To him, the drone Marcus was flying wasn't just a machine. It was a physical manifestation of the freedom he craved. The Karen of Sterling Heights, a woman named Mrs. Sterling Vance, represented everything Marcus had grown to despise about the domestic tranquility he fought to protect in the shadows. She lived in a world of superficial perfections, where the value of a person was determined by the price of their car and the exclusivity of their social circle, and she viewed any anomaly as a direct threat to her status. To her, Marcus was a suspicious intruder, and Julian was a nuisance, her prejudice so deeply ingrained that she felt completely justified in her escalating hysteria and verbal abuse. She didn't see a federal agent or a dreaming child. She saw undesirables who needed to be reminded of their place in the social hierarchy of the suburbs. Her screams were a symphony of entitlement, a loud and ugly defense of a privilege that she felt was under siege by the mere presence of people who looked different. As Julian's father, Elias, ran across the park with his head bowed and his hands open in a gesture of submission, Marcus felt a surge of ancient, familiar anger boiling beneath his tactical composure. Elias was terrified, his voice shaking as he apologized to the screaming woman, begging Julian to pick up his muddy book and leave before the real trouble started. Marcus watched as the man tried to shield his son with his own body, a scene of systemic humiliation that made the agent's blood turn to ice in his veins. For Marcus, this wasn't just a local dispute. It was a reflection of every injustice he had witnessed and every biased barrier he had broken down in his own climb to power. The mission to catch the arms smuggler was still active in his earpiece, but for the first time in his career, the human casualty in front of him took precedence over the target in the mansion. "You did nothing wrong, Julian. Stand up," Marcus said, his voice a low, resonant command that cut through Mrs. Sterling Vance's shrill shouting like a knife through silk. He placed a steady, reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the child trembling beneath his touch, and he forced Julian to meet his gaze with a look of absolute, unshakable certainty. Elias looked at Marcus with a mixture of confusion and dread, whispering for him to just let it go before the police arrived. but Marcus only tightened his grip on the boy's shoulder. He was done being a ghost, done being the invisible protector of a society that would treat a child like Julian with such casual, unearned cruelty. At that moment, the internal conflict between his duty to remain covert and his duty to protect the innocent resolved into a singular burning purpose that no agency protocol could override. The external pressure intensified as the woman fumbled with her smartphone, her fingers flying across the screen as she dialed emergency services with a triumphant, malicious smirk on her face. Marcus could hear the distant, rising wail of sirens, a sound that usually signaled the end of a covert operation and the beginning of a messy administrative nightmare for his handlers at Langley. He knew that interacting with local police would likely blow his cover and jeopardize months of surveillance on the international arms dealer across the street, possibly even putting his own life at risk. Yet, as he looked down at Julian's tear-streaked face and the muddy aviation book, he realized that some missions were worth the cost of exposure, and some lessons were more important than a clean file. He began to run through a new set of tactical calculations, preparing to turn the impending police arrival into a weapon of justice rather than a tool of oppression. The local police cars screeched to a halt on the pristine park grass, their tires tearing into the manicured sod in a display of authority that was as aggressive as it was biased. 2 officers bailed out of the cruisers, their hands already resting on their sidearms, their eyes scanning the scene and immediately settling on Marcus and Elias as the primary threats. They didn't ask for statements. They followed the script that Mrs. Sterling Vance had written with her hysterical 911 call, screaming for Marcus to put his hands in the air and for the gardener to get on the ground. The bias was palpable, a thick, suffocating air that ignored the woman's unhinged behavior in favor of the easier, more comfortable narrative of an intruder and an accomplice. Marcus stood his ground, his hands relaxed at his sides, his eyes never leaving the lead officer's face as he prepared to flip the script on everyone involved. "Officer, the lady is lying. We were just looking at the sky," Julian whispered, his voice small and fragile against the backdrop of the shouting police and the woman's continued accusations. The lead officer didn't even acknowledge the child's voice, his focus entirely on Marcus, whom he perceived as a dangerous element simply because of the calmness Thorne projected in the face of drawn weapons. The woman continued to lie, claiming that Marcus had a gun in his backpack and had threatened her life when she politely asked him to leave the private park area. She was playing the role of the victim with practiced ease, her eyes darting toward the police as she looked for the validation of her manufactured fear. Marcus remained a pillar of silence, his internal clock counting down the seconds as he waited for the perfect tactical moment to reveal the true power he held behind his casual clothing. The officers grew more agitated by Marcus's lack of submission, interpreted his silence as defiance, and began to close the distance with handcuffs drawn and voices rising in volume. One officer grabbed Elias by the arm, shoving the terrified landscaper toward the patrol car, while the other moved toward Marcus with a baton extended, ready to enforce a compliance that wasn't legally required. Julian let out a sharp cry of fear, reaching for his father's hand as the weight of the neighborhood's exclusion finally manifested into a physical, violent reality. Marcus didn't flinch. He simply shifted his weight, his eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light that caused the advancing officer to hesitate for a split second, sensing a level of danger that didn't match the man's civilian attire. Thorne knew that in 10 seconds, the world of Sterling Heights was going to collide with the reality of federal national security. Inside his ear canal, the tiny bone conduction earpiece crackled with a voice from the Tactical Operations Center, informing him that the local police interference was threatening the integrity of the smuggler's extraction window. Marcus knew he had to act now, not just to save the mission, but to salvage the soul of the young boy who was watching his father being humiliated on the grass. He reached for his ruggedized tactical watch, a piece of equipment that looked like a standard fitness tracker but contained a direct, encrypted uplink to a constellation of satellites and a rapid response team. With a single, deliberate press of a sequence of buttons, he broadcast a code red interference signal, an authorization that bypassed all local jurisdictions and activated a level of federal power that the local officers couldn't even fathom. The air began to vibrate with a low-frequency hum, a precursor to the storm that was about to descend upon the park. Mrs. Sterling Vance was still screaming, her voice a jagged edge of entitlement as she demanded that the officers take them both to jail and make an example of the people who dared to ruin her morning. She was so blinded by her own arrogance that she didn't notice the change in the atmosphere, the way the birds had suddenly gone silent and the wind had picked up as if a localized weather event was approaching. The police officers were too busy trying to manhandle Elias to notice the dark, unmarked helicopters that were cresting the horizon, flying low and fast beneath the radar of the local municipal airport. Marcus took a step forward, his hand still on Julian's shoulder, his presence expanding until he seemed to dwarf the police and the hysterical woman combined. "You've made a very big mistake," he said, his voice a calm, terrifying promise that chilled the lead officer to the bone. The sound of the heavy rotors suddenly exploded over the park, a deafening, rhythmic thumping that flattened the tall grass and sent the woman's designer sun hat flying into the mud. 3 massive, blacked-out SUVs breached the park's perimeter fence, driving with a precision and speed that ignored the manicured lawns and flower beds that Julian's father had spent weeks tending. The local police officers froze, their weapons still drawn, but their eyes wide with a sudden, paralyzing confusion, as they realized they were no longer the most powerful people in the vicinity. The SUVs slid into a tactical formation around the group, the doors swinging open in unison to reveal a team of heavily armed operatives in dark gray tactical gear, their movements a blur of practiced, lethal efficiency. This was the rapid response team Marcus had summoned, a force that operated above the law of the suburbs and answered only to the highest levels of the government. Marcus reached into his pocket and produced a small, leather-bound ID case, flipping it open to reveal the gold and blue seal of the Central Intelligence Agency, his name and rank glowing under the sunlight. The lead local officer's face turned a sickly shade of gray, his weapon lowering instinctively as he recognized the authority that had just rendered his own badge completely irrelevant. Thorne didn't look at the officer. He looked at Mrs. Sterling Vance, whose screams had died in her throat, replaced by a choking, gasping sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at the armed men, then at the black helicopters hovering like giant insects above her home, and finally at the man she had called a thug, realizing with a sickening jolt that she had attacked a lion in a sheep's clothing. The power dynamic of the park had been inverted in less than 30 seconds, and the fallout was going to be catastrophic for her comfortable, biased life. "Secure the perimeter. Target house is the estate at 1420. Execute the warrant now," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the weight of a general on a battlefield as his tactical team moved with explosive speed toward the smuggler's mansion. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his tone was absolute, causing the local police to back away as if they were the intruders in their own jurisdiction. Julian watched with wide, disbelieving eyes as the man who had shown him the drone suddenly became a commander of a small army, his young mind trying to process the shift from victim to protector. Elias was released by the stunned officer, stumbling back toward his son, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and a new, flickering flame of hope that he hadn't felt in years. The neighborhood of Sterling Heights was no longer a sanctuary of exclusion. It was a federal crime scene, and Marcus Thorne was the architect of its reckoning. The woman tried to crawl away, her designer leggings stained with the mud of the park she had fought so hard to keep pure. But Marcus stepped into her path with a look of cold, clinical judgment. He didn't need to touch her. His presence alone was enough to pin her to the spot, her illusion of superiority crumbling like wet ash in the face of true, unchecked power. "You filed a false police report and obstructed a federal counterterrorism operation," Marcus said, his voice a flat, emotionless recitation of her new reality that sounded like the closing of a prison door. She began to sob, a pathetic, high-pitched sound that had no effect on the man who had spent his life dealing with the consequences of real violence and global instability. He looked at the local police chief, who had just arrived on the scene in a frantic state of damage control, and signaled for him to take the woman into custody. The local police chief was stuttering, his hat in his hand as he apologized to Marcus in a desperate attempt to distance his department from the biased actions of his officers. Thorne ignored the apologies, his focus shifting back to the mission and the team that was currently breaching the front doors of the arms dealer's mansion with flashbangs and tactical precision. He knew that the fallout from this would be immense. There would be hearings, reports, and a firestorm of administrative paperwork waiting for him back at the agency. But as he looked at Julian, who was standing a little taller now, his aviation book held firmly against his chest, Marcus knew that the paperwork was a small price to pay for the look of dignity returning to the boy's eyes. He had used the full weight of the United States government to defend a child's right to dream, and for the first time in a decade, he felt like a hero instead of a ghost. The park was a scene of controlled chaos, with federal agents moving in and out of the neighbor's mansion, carrying out crates of evidence and leading a group of handcuffed men toward the black SUVs. The residents of Sterling Heights watched from their windows, their sense of security shattered by the realization that their neighborhood had been a nest for international crime, protected only by their own superficial biases. Marcus turned to Julian and Elias, his posture softening as the tactical intensity of the moment began to recede, replaced by a quiet, protective warmth. He had sacrificed his cover, his mission profile, and his anonymity, but in return, he had reclaimed a piece of his own humanity that he thought had been lost in the shadows of Langley. The connection he had forged with the boy was the most successful operation of his career, a win that couldn't be measured in intelligence gathered or targets eliminated. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the now ruined lawn of the park, Marcus stood with the boy and his father, a small island of truth in a sea of collapsing pretenses. He knew his time in the field might be over after such a public exposure. But as he looked at the sky, the same sky Julian dreamed of conquering, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since he was a child himself. The mission was a success on every level. The arms dealer was in custody, and a biased system had been forced to blink in the face of a higher authority. Marcus Thorne, the special agent who had spent his life hunting threats in the dark, had finally stepped into the light to protect the most vulnerable asset of all, a child's hope. The neighborhood of Sterling Heights would never be the same, and neither would the man who had finally found a reason to connect with the world he was sworn to protect. The air in the park was thick with the ozone of the flashbangs, and the heavy, rhythmic beat of the black helicopters hovering like watchful gods over the suburb. As the federal agents led the international arms dealer away in shackles, Marcus Thorne stood in the center of the chaos, a pillar of immovable justice. The local police officers had lowered their weapons, their faces pale and drawn as they realized the magnitude of their professional failure. Mrs. Sterling Vance was no longer screaming. She was collapsed on her knees in the mud, her designer clothes ruined, sobbing with a mixture of fear and the sudden realization that her social status offered no protection against federal law. The visual contrast was absolute. The woman who claimed to own the neighborhood was now a prisoner of her own prejudice, while the boy she tried to exile stood beside a man of true, global power. Marcus turned his attention away from the tactical team and knelt down in the grass, placing himself at eye level with Julian, who was still trembling from the intensity of the confrontation. The special agent ignored the flashing lights of the patrol cars and the radio chatter, creating a small, silent sanctuary of human connection in the middle of the operation. He looked at the boy's mud-stained aviation book, and then back into Julian's eyes, which were wide with a mixture of terror and newfound wonder. "Look at me, Julian," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a low, steady frequency that commanded immediate attention and calmed the boy's racing heart. The agent's hands, which had handled weapons of war and documents of state secrets, now gently brushed the dirt off the child's small shoulder, a gesture of profound and healing tenderness. "You see all this? The helicopters, the teams, the authority?" Marcus asked, gesturing slowly toward the massive display of federal might that had just dismantled the neighborhood's superficial peace. Julian nodded slowly, unable to find his voice as he looked at the CIA badge still visible on Marcus's chest, the gold reflecting the setting sun. "None of this matters as much as what is inside your head and the dreams you carry in that book," Marcus continued, his words carrying the weight of a solemn oath. He explained to the boy that the people who tried to make him feel small were simply terrified of a world they couldn't control or understand. He spoke of his own journey from a child who was told he didn't belong to a man who now protected the very fabric of the nation, using his own life as a blueprint for the boy's future. Suddenly, the local police chief stepped forward, his voice cracking as he tried to offer a formal apology for the unfortunate misunderstanding caused by his officers and the woman's false report. Marcus didn't stand up. He kept his eyes on Julian, effectively ignoring the chief's political damage control, until the silence became heavy and suffocating for the local authorities. When Thorne finally looked up, His gaze was like a laser, stripping away the chief's excuses and leaving only the raw truth of the department's biased actions. A misunderstanding is a wrong turn on a highway, Chief. What I saw here was the weaponization of a badge against a child and a hard-working man, Marcus stated, his voice a cold, clinical indictment. The chief withered under the stare, realizing that his department's future was now as precarious as the woman's reputation in this elite, judgmental community. Marcus then looked at the woman in the mud and spoke not with anger, but with a devastatingly objective clarity that summarized the end of her reign of terror. He informed her that she was being charged with obstruction of a federal anti-terrorism investigation and filing a false police report, crimes that carried significant mandatory prison time. Your arrogance didn't just hurt this boy. It compromised the security of this country by interfering with a high-level extraction, he told her, his words echoing across the silent park. The woman looked up, her eyes pleading for a mercy she had refused to show Julian only minutes before, but she found only the cold, hard surface of the law. The neighbors watching from their windows saw their peer being treated like a common criminal, her illusion of superiority shattered by the very order she had tried to invoke. The emotional turning point reached its peak when Marcus stood up and called for his lead tactical officer to bring over the primary drone module from the command SUV. He turned back to Julian and his father, Elias, who was standing with a newfound sense of height, his head no longer bowed in the presence of the wealthy residents. Marcus took the sophisticated, commercial-grade drone he had been using as a cover and began to disconnect the sensitive tactical sensors, leaving only the high-performance flight mechanics intact. He held the device out to Julian, the sleek carbon fiber wings catching the light of the dying sun like a promise of things to come. The boy's hands shook as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the technology he had only ever seen in the pages of his tattered aviation books. This country is built on the backs of people like your father, and it is defended by people like you, Marcus said, his voice resonant and filled with a pride that he hadn't felt for anyone in years. He told Julian that the sky was the only place where no one could build a fence or tell him he didn't belong, and that the drone was a tool to help him map his own path to the clouds. Julian looked at the gift, then at his father, and finally back at Marcus, his tears of fear finally turning into tears of a deep, transformative gratitude. The connection was no longer about a spy and a witness. It was about a mentor passing a torch to a new generation of defenders. The mission was a success, but the restoration of a child's dignity was the true victory that Marcus would carry with him. The following weeks in Sterling Heights were marked by a silence that was far more genuine than the artificial peace that had preceded the federal raid. The Karen of the neighborhood, Mrs. Sterling Vance, faced a public and humiliating legal battle that stripped away her social standing as effectively as the handcuffs had stripped away her dignity. Her mansion, once a symbol of unassailable status, became a landmark of caution, a reminder to the other residents that the law does not serve as a private security force for personal prejudices. The local police department was forced into a massive federal retraining program, with several officers being suspended for their biased conduct during the incident. Justice had not just arrived, it had settled in, forcing a community built on exclusion to finally confront the ugly reality of its own intolerance and the systemic rot it had nurtured. Marcus Thorne returned to the CIA headquarters at Langley, but he was no longer the same emotionally numb operative who had stepped into that park weeks earlier. The mission report he filed was thick with tactical successes, but his private reflections were filled with the image of a young boy holding an aviation book with renewed hope. He found that he could no longer view the world as a simple chessboard of threats. His connection with Julian had reawakened a long-dormant part of his soul that remembered why he had chosen to serve in the first place. He began to advocate for more community-focused intelligence gathering, using his considerable influence to shift the agency's culture toward a more human-centric approach. Marcus had rediscovered his purpose, realizing that the greatest service a patriot can perform is to protect the dreams of the innocent from the arrogance of the powerful. Julian's life underwent a radical transformation that was both concrete and deeply spiritual, as the Sterling Justice Initiative, funded by the seized assets of the arms smuggler, provided his family with the resources they deserved. His father, Elias, was no longer just the landscaper. He was given the opportunity to start his own landscaping firm, serving a community that now looked at him with a mix of shame and newfound respect. Julian spent his afternoons in a specialized aviation program, the high-tech drone Marcus had gifted him serving as his primary training tool and a constant reminder of his worth. He no longer walked with his head bowed or his voice whispered. He moved with the quiet confidence of a boy who knew that the sky belonged to him as much as anyone else. The mud-stained book was replaced by flight manuals, but Julian kept the old book on his shelf as a sacred relic of the day he found his wings. The park itself became a symbol of change, as the neighborhood association was forced to dismantle the private property signs and open the space to the broader community as part of a legal settlement. It was no longer a guarded fortress of the wealthy, but a vibrant, integrated space where children from all backgrounds played together under the shade of the same ancient oaks. The heavy surveillance was replaced by genuine community engagement, with local residents finally stepping out of their mansions to meet the neighbors they had spent years trying to ignore. The atmosphere of Sterling Heights shifted from one of suspicious exclusion to one of tentative, growing inclusion, proving that even the most hardened barriers of prejudice can be dismantled by a single act of courageous justice. The park was no longer a visual contrast of wealth and poverty, but a testament to the power of shared humanity. Marcus Thorne remained a silent guardian from afar, receiving periodic updates on Julian's progress through discreet channels that bypassed the usual bureaucratic noise of the agency. He watched from the shadows as the boy he had saved grew into a focused, brilliant young man, his passion for aviation fueling a trajectory that pointed straight toward the stars. Thorne's own career flourished, but he measured his success not by the medals he received, but by the tangible impact he had made on a single family's life in a suburban park. He had learned that true power is not found in the ability to intimidate or control, but in the capacity to serve as a relentless shield for those who cannot defend themselves. The cold spy had become a mentor, and in doing so, he had secured a victory more lasting than any mission objective he had ever achieved. The moral of the story resonated through the city, serving as a powerful reminder that the integrity of a nation is defined by how it treats its most vulnerable citizens, not its most wealthy ones. True power is not meant to intimidate the innocent, but to serve as a relentless shield that protects justice and destroys the arrogance of prejudice wherever it takes root. Marcus and Julian's story became a legend in both the intelligence community and the neighborhood, a tale of two worlds colliding to create a better, more equitable reality for everyone involved. It proved that one person's refusal to accept injustice can spark a transformation that echoes through generations, changing the very fabric of a society. As the sun set on a more inclusive Sterling Heights, it was clear that the light of truth had finally chased away the shadows of a long-standing and bitter exclusion. 15 years had passed, and the Mission Control Center at Langley was a cathedral of high-definition monitors and hushed tactical whispers that felt far removed from the sun-drenched park in Sterling Heights. Director Marcus Thorne stood on the elevated observation deck, his hair now salted with gray at the temples, but his presence was as formidable and focused as it had been on that pivotal Monday morning. He watched the main screen, where a complex extraction operation in a distant conflict zone was being guided by a lead drone pilot with surgical precision. The operation was flawless, a ballet of technology and strategy that avoided civilian casualties while neutralizing a significant threat, a testament to the new human-centric doctrines Thorne had championed throughout his career. He wasn't just watching a mission, he was watching the culmination of a legacy he had begun with a simple act of defiance against a suburban bully. On the floor below, Captain Julian Mendoza sat at the primary console, his flight suit bearing the decorations of a man who had become one of the Air Force's most elite intelligence operators. His hands moved over the controls with a grace that was both mechanical and deeply intuitive, a skill set that had been born from the gift of a carbon fiber drone 15 years ago. He navigated the complexities of the mission with the same calm resolve he had learned from the man who now watched him from above, a silent communication flowing between the mentor and the protege. When the mission status turned green, signaling a total success, Julian leaned back and exhaled, his gaze momentarily drifting to the small, faded aviation book that sat discreetly on the corner of his high-tech workstation. It was the same book he had held in the mud, a physical anchor that reminded him exactly why he fought to keep the world's skies free. Director Thorne descended the stairs and placed a firm, fatherly hand on Julian's shoulder, a gesture that mirrored the one he had made in the park so many years earlier. They didn't need words to acknowledge the journey they had shared. The silent pride in Marcus's eyes and the respectful nod from Julian spoke of a bond forged in the fires of shared injustice and ultimate victory. The neighborhood of Sterling Heights was now a distant memory, but the lessons learned on its manicured lawns,